welcome to Mainstream Moxie. I'm glad to have you as a guest today.
I'm happy to be here, Thorunn, on this very special Monday called Labor Day.
It is work, 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 work.
Yep. So we thought we'd spend today talking about how Moxie and work tie together.
Well, I think, how we even kicked off this podcast was all about work and, talking about the work that we needed to put in to figure out how to do this thing, right?
Yes, and some parts of it felt like fun, and some parts of it didn't.
Felt quite overwhelming.
Yes, but I think part of why we were able to get it done was that we supported each other.
Yes.
And when I felt the need to vent, you felt the need to listen.
I listened, even though sometimes I did say that sounds like a you problem, not a me problem.
That's true.
Yeah,
That's true, which felt a little harsh in the moment, but I got over it. But how are, you're an entrepreneur and you don't have someone standing over you, making you filled with Moxie and do stuff. So how do you kind of generate self-Moxie?
Sometimes that's hard, I think that when you do have a boss, it kind of holds you accountable.
Yes, agreed.
So when you are a entrepreneur or self-employed or, the buck stops with you, you have to hold yourself accountable. And it's not something for everyone, I have to admit. And it's a discipline that you have to train. It's a daily reminder, even every task reminder. And I thought that was interesting with the last 9 months of guests that we've had, that's something that's been touched upon and the work that goes into it. And, we keep referring to Moxie. Everyone has got Moxie and, Moxie, Moxie, Moxie. But I would, you and I have talked about this, and the reason we wanted to bring it into today for Labor Day and talking about work was the work that goes into doing these things, whatever that thing is, how big or small it may be. And so when you are doing that, it doesn't have to be that you're your own boss, but just if you're doing something that, like our guests have talked about, it's the work that you have to put into it and, holding yourself accountable, even doing the stuff you don't like doing.
Yeah, I mean, Moxie sounds like a very kind of lightning bolt kind of word, but there's a lot of hours that goes into the final product of kind of arriving at that moment of Moxie, which I think some of our guests felt was not something they thought about in the moment, but something upon reflection and looking at what they've done because of being on the show.
Well, some of them were even surprised after the fact that, like, oh my God, look at all the work I put into getting to, from point A to point B. And I just thought about point B because that's what I was excited and passionate about. And so it didn't seem like work at the time, but it's all these, steps along the way. It's one incremental step. You've seen the meme, right? Or there's a picture on social media, it keeps going around, and it's about the stick figure climbing up a mountain. And it's one step at a time. But if you look at the whole mountain, it seems so big and so hard to get there. But if you just focus on the one step, and I feel like that's been something that each of our guests has kind of talked about in their own, analogy, whether it be a rung on a ladder or, one step at a time or, one task at a time. But I feel like that's been a huge theme with all of our guests, and they are so diverse in both their stories and their lives and their own Moxie that I have found that has been such a great and fun thing to learn about and, hear how they tackle each thing.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I felt like that's been a big thread running through the guests. And I feel, when I think about their stories applied to my story, when I think back to writing my dissertation in grad school and looking at what I needed to produce and then breaking it down into small increments and holding myself accountable, but also telling my advisors I was going to have something to them by that date. So I had an outside accountability. And it was just sitting down whether I felt like it or not, and I would say I'm just going to sit down for 10 minutes and see what I can push out or what I can read. And then 10 minutes turned into 20 and 20 turned into an hour, and then I got some good time in. So I feel like that's that incremental baby stepping and playing almost mental tricks on yourself.
For sure. I think that's something, and when you're in the moment, that's when you kind of realize that you have to, do a little psychologist on yourself.
Yes, and that notion of being accountable to someone else as a motivator not that you want to look for what's called extrinsic motivation, something outside of you, but being accountable to someone else does, there's a certain amount of pride that goes into that, or hearkening back to maybe a value system that you were raised with.
Yes. I mean, I find that I'm self-employed, obviously, but I work with clients. And so I'm accountable to them. I'm accountable to the project that I, committed to, that I'm being paid to do. So, sometimes even when I know I'm jammed, but I'm like, all right, I'm going to deliver X to you by this day. In the back of my head, I'm like, all right, I need to get this done.
Right.
Because I need to deliver, my word means something and I want it to mean something. So that like pushes the extra motivation. Not that I'm not wanting to do the work. Life happens, we get busy, but it's that accountability and putting the work in. And I think that's something that, from our first guest, Kirk Neller, when he was like, you just have to put the work in.
Yeah.
And it's not always sexy. It's downright hard sometimes.
The only thing that Moxie and sexy have in common is the X.
Can we get that on a t-shirt?
Yeah, okay. I think it's time for the merch.
Well, maybe in the next chapter.
Yes. The other thing is perfection versus good enough.
I think a lot of people get hung up on that.
Well, in the books about podcasting and the research that we did, the reading
you did.
Well, okay, so I gave you the Cliff Note version, but there was a lot about that. Don't even get attached to perfection.
Interesting.
Get an episode out, let it be good enough, and let yourself be okay with that.
Is that kind of the 80-20 rule?
What is the 80-20 rule?
If you get 80% right, you're basically good to go.
That's a B.
Well, the point, I usually like to go 90-10. But the rule is, if you look it up, and I'm sure I'm butchering this, but it's, I was taught a long time ago, I think I was in college, that it's the 80-20 rule. Because if you get 80% of it done, you can nitpick at the 20% until the cows come home.
Right.
But you can't let yourself get in that whirlwind of it, just stuck in that 20%, because then you're never going to get it done. And it's going to be maybe even worse, because you're going to be so stuck in it. So I like to do 90-10. That at least gets me an A- if we're looking at it academically.
I'm sorry.
But, there's something to that. And sometimes, when you're stuck, or if you're a perfectionist, I get it. You want to have it perfect, but perfection is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
So is it better to be stuck and not, put something out? And, if we're talking about the podcast as an example, is it better to actually put something out and then learn from that and move from that? I think that's also something that our guests have talked about, that you have a starting point, get it out there. And then, okay, there's no such thing as a mistake or failure,
right?
But you learn from things that didn't work, things that did work, or things that you're like, this worked but I didn't like it,
right?
Or I like to fix this. So I think everything is about learning.
Absolutely. Well, I think that we have learned a lot from our guests, and I know I have definitely reflected on my own life through the lens of their experiences and kind of felt validated by some of what they said, challenged by other things, and inspired to take some of their advice and apply it to my own life.
Well, isn't it the perfect trifecta?
Yes, and that is the goal of this podcast.
Yeah. Well, I've had a lot of fun. And
the fun part.
Yeah, you get stuck in the work part, but I love learning from people and hearing their stories and just being inspired, as you said. So hearing, let me back up. From picking our guests and deciding who we wanted to have on, who we personally thought was interesting and had an interesting story or did something that was different. You may not think it when you see so-and-so on the street, but learning about them and, every single one of them has been fascinating and has done something so different from each other as well as from you and I, even though there's some overlaps. But I've just, thought it was fascinating talking to each and every one of them and learning something, and I've taken away from each one of them. And I think that's been, for me personally, great, and I hope our listeners have done the same thing.
I hope so too. And I think we should just wish everyone a happy Labor Day.
And that they're not working today.
And if you are, thank you. And we'll be back in 2 weeks with a guest who will inspire us with their Moxie.
Sounds like a plan. Happy holiday.